Okay, hello, Yoga for Arthritis members. It is so great to be here on this Friday, July 5th. I know a lot of people are away for the weekend and spending time with their families, which is lovely. Um, I have one submitted question by a person who happens to be here. So I'm going to answer that first, and any subsequent follow-up questions, and then I just have a couple of announcements, and we'll be done for the day. Um, I just want to remind you, those of you that enjoy these, if you're listening to this, if you're watching this, it means you're a YFA member. And if you are a YFA member, it means that you have the opportunity to submit a question to me at any time. And you also, of course, are invited to these live. But if you can't make it live, please send me a question. I will answer every question that gets submitted. Sometimes it pushes me right up against the end of the hour, but I have never not answered a question that was submitted for the Q&A. So please consider doing so if you have any burning questions about yoga and or arthritis whatsoever. Okay, so the question that I have here from Diane,
Oh,
and I think that I think I did talk about this in last month's Q&A. So this maybe is a follow-up to that, or maybe I talked about it, mentioned it briefly in a previous Q&A, and I'm sure if I did, Kylie will link to that in the notes for this recording because she's great about doing that. So Diane asks, I would like to know more about concussions and meditations. What form of meditation is good for people who have suffered a concussion? Okay, so I want to remind dear listeners, all of you who may or may not know this, that I suffered a traumatic brain injury myself. It is part of the subject of my most recent book, which is Driving Home. In fact, it's in the title, Cancer, Concussion, Mom and Me. Oh, so I had a concussion, um, a traumatic brain injury. And if you are interested in knowing more about the experience of traumatic brain injuries, I mean, that is one of the many reasons why you might enjoy the book. Um, but it's interesting. And I didn't pull this up. I actually should have. Um, there is a section in the book where I talk about meditation and specifically, okay, so now I'm wondering, did I actually talk about it in a Q&A, or I'm just remembering when I read this book for the audiobook recording, but I'll talk about that later. Okay, so I definitely talk about meditation and concussion in the book because what happened to me is that I had a concussion. And for those of you who don't know my story, my mother had cancer. I was caring for my mother, and then I was hit by a truck. And so I was trying to manage grief and loss and caretaking, and also the many effects of traumatic brain injury, which include cognitive effects, but also motor effects and emotional effects, which is, of course, there's a lot of overlap between the experience of grief and caregiving and it kind of hits you on all sides as well, across the koshas, so shall we say, for the yogis in the room. So when I went to my primary care provider, who's the one who identified, they did not screen me for concussion in the emergency room after I had the brain injury. They didn't know I had a brain injury. They were like making sure none of my organs were punctured, and then they sent me on my way. And I was having follow-up, I was having side effects, which I didn't know were side effects, or I was having symptoms of concussion that I thought were effects of the accident itself. And I called my primary care doctor, who immediately screened and identified the concussion. And on a visit with him, I was asking questions. He is a general primary care doctor, but has sort of an open mind about integrative care. So, and this is useful to know, there are board certified medical specialties. There's an integrative medicine specialty that did not exist years ago. There's a functional medicine specialty. So if you are seeking integrative care, you might want to find a primary care doctor who has one of those specialties. I actually am comfortable going to a general internist, for example, as long as they are open-minded about integrative care, are supportive of my journey with integrative care, because I want both. That's what integrative means, in fact, right? The conventional and complementary healthcare. So in having this conversation with him, what do we know about the science of traumatic brain injury, and because I'm very proactive about my health, what can I do that could help hasten my recovery, especially because I had made some unknowingly poor decisions immediately following the accident. I was using my brain on overdrive when I should have been, probably giving it an opportunity to heal. So one, I wanted to know, is there anything I could do to actually help recover? And then two, I wanted to know, is there anything I need to be careful about doing that might cause further harm? And meditation was at the front of my mind in this conversation. Also, asana, like the asana that I could do was very limited because of the effects on my motor function. And the asana practice was very frustrating to me because of how limited it was and how much I struggled, not just with the motor function parts of it, like being able to move my body in the ways that I wanted to, but also having to use my cognition to think about where I was putting my body in space or what I was doing in what order was really frustrating. So I was thinking, well, I can definitely do deep breathing. I can definitely do relaxation. Those seem like a slam dunk. I know that those are going to be not harmful and likely beneficial. But meditation, I could kind of see it going both ways, right? I could see how, on the one hand, it's a mental practice. It builds gray matter. It could improve. We know from scientific literature of meditation for healthy people, non-concussed people, that it can improve some of the things that I was struggling with. But on the other hand, the prevailing wisdom was when you've had a concussion, at least in the immediate aftermath, you should rest the brain and not overtax it. And therefore, could the mental practices of meditation be overtaxing my brain by trying to use it in a focused way? And so I was going to my doctor to say, like, is either of these true? Could it help? Could it harm? Um, and his answer was, of course, we don't know. We don't know. We know he actually said, our understanding of concussion is not as great as we think it is. Like, even, you think that there's like the concussion protocol that they use in football, for example, in sports. And I know that there has been a lot of headway in the science of concussion, but we are now recently finding that, in fact, that the protocol of like rest, don't move, stay in a dark room, like that actually may be ill-advised for concussion. So I, of course, went to the medical literature myself, and I thought, well, let me look and see what I can find about the latest research that maybe my primary care doctor isn't aware of because, it's not his specialty. He's not an integrative neurologist. Okay, so when I went to the medical literature, first of all, because of my cognitive dysfunction, it was difficult for me to even search the literature, but let alone read it. But essentially, there was nothing. Okay, so the accident happened in 2018. I did not find a single paper on the effects of meditation for concussion. However, when I was recording the audiobook, oh no, yeah. Yeah, when I was recording the audiobook for this, which by the way, I just finished. It will be finished soon. Those of you who have the book and don't want to have to read it on paper, the audiobook is done. Well, it's recorded by me. Kylie still has to edit it, but it will be coming out soon. And if you haven't bought the book yet, if you buy it through us, you get the audiobook with it. And also, if you only want the audiobook, that's going to be available on all the platforms. So you can get the audiobook from us or on wherever you get your audiobook content. But because I was revisiting that chapter, things have changed since then. And I thought, let me actually check and see if there have been any changes in what we know on this topic. And so I am actually going to share my screen with you and show you what I found. So I'm going to go, let's see, to share screen. And I'm going to show you how I do it, because I know some of you are interested in the process of understanding the evidence. So I'm just going to give you a little window into that through the answering of this question. Okay, so I'm at PubMed and I'm going to do a search, and the search is based on a PICO question. PICO is population, intervention, comparison, and outcomes. Okay, so you can use any combination of those things in your search. You have to start with a research question. And I think the research question is, what are the effects of meditation for people with concussion? So the population is concussion, the intervention is meditation, and the outcomes, we're interested in any outcome, any comparison group. So that's what we're going to search for. And so meditation is our intervention, and we're going to link it with an and because we want both of these. Now, for concussion, I'm actually going to put concussion and traumatic brain injury because that's going to probably catch some things that I wouldn't catch if I used one of those terms alone. Not all concussions meet the qualification for traumatic brain injury, but all traumatic brain injuries are a concussion. So I'm going to put concussion or traumatic brain injury. And when I do this, I have to put, okay, so I want to put brackets around saying either one of these things, right? Meditation and either one of these things. But I need to put quotation marks around traumatic brain injury because I don't want the words traumatic and brain and injury separate, right? Because then I could get something like, does a knee injury result in effects on the brain for people with a history of traumatic psychological incident or something like that, right? You want the words, you want the phrase together. So it's got to be in quotes. Okay, so that's my search term. And then I'm going to search. And we come up with 33 papers. I did filter that I want papers that are available in English because that's the only language I speak, unfortunately. And now I'm going to look to the side here. So this is when these papers were published. Okay, so I don't want to read a paper about this from 2005 because I know the science has advanced since then. And in fact, we know that there was a major uptick in the research literature in integrative health in general and in yoga and meditation specifically around 2010. So I tend to use 2010 as sort of the benchmark for, what evidence I'm looking for. And because there's kind of this gap here, we're going to start it at 2016. Okay. And then we have 25 papers to consider. Now we could go to the side here and limit it further. We could say, okay, I only want papers that are available for free, which may bias my search. I only want systematic reviews, etc. Okay. I would say humans, but I don't think they have rats meditating yet. We haven't gotten that far. Okay, so let's start to look at some of these papers. And I have already done this. So I've seen these papers. So I'm just going to give you some information about what I found. This first one, it's feasibility and preliminary evidence, okay, of an online yoga meditation intervention. These are young adults. The effects in young adults may not be the same as what you're going to find in older populations. Our brains are different. And it's also important to note that this is 15 people. Okay, so 15 young adults with concussion, and their concussions were within the past 5 years. I will say to you that there are some people who experience lifelong effects from their concussion. I am one of them, although certainly the symptoms in the immediate period after the concussion are far more severe. So it's a range of time within the past 5 years that they've had their concussions, and there's no comparison group. Okay, so what does that mean? We only know that this happened to occur for these 15 people who meditated, but we don't know what would have happened if they hadn't meditated. And especially we know that concussion symptoms tend to resolve over time. At least they tend to improve over time, I should say. So we don't know how much they would have gotten better anyway without the meditation. That's an important caveat. That being said, this particular intervention was online guided meditation. And they were primarily looking to see, is it feasible? Can people with a concussion meditate? And they did find, yes, indeed, they could meditate. And it appears that there was a slight decrease in some of their symptoms, and the number of symptoms that were worse than before the concussion was reduced. Okay, so for example, one of the symptoms of concussion is headache. Okay, so not only is it saying, their headache symptoms improved, but also the number of symptoms that were better than, not as bad, not worse than before concussion, right? Like maybe you still have a headache, but it's not worse than before you had a concussion. That improved as well. And this is a very small sample, and it's not really designed to answer the question about whether meditation improves concussion symptoms, right? It's really to pave the way for larger, more conclusive studies. So you've got to take that particular one with a grain of salt, saying guided meditation might be useful. Now, guided meditation is a very specific approach to meditation. There are lots of ways to do a guided meditation, but something that's key about a guided meditation is you don't have to do it on your own, right? You don't have to have the discipline to stay focused on your own because somebody is guiding you along. Somebody is reminding you what to do with your mind. So you kind of have support in the meditation experience, which might be important for people who have recently had a concussion. Some of these papers are not really answering our question. This one is a case, so it's a single individual with tremor. And so if you were working with somebody who had a tremor after concussion, this case might be interesting to you. It's only one person. So again, you got to take that with a grain of salt. I'm not going to go into that with much detail because tremor is only one of many symptoms that people might experience. Okay, so here is a scoping review. And a scoping review tries to cast a wide net and look at a bunch of different literature related to this topic. And this one is specifically on mindfulness-based interventions. Mindfulness, again, is a specific approach to, it could be to meditation, right? So you could be doing a mindfulness meditation. You could also be doing another kind of mindfulness practice, like mindfully washing the dishes or mindfully taking a walk or engaging in MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is a whole program that uses a mindfulness approach. And so this actually has 29 different articles that they extracted the data from. And I do want to say, so I'm showing you the abstracts here. I want to remind everybody that an abstract is like a movie trailer. It does not actually tell you how good the movie is or what the movie is really about or everything that happens in the movie. The point of a trailer is to decide if you want to watch the movie. You should never make clinical or health decisions for yourself or anybody else based on an abstract, because it's like writing a review for a movie based on the trailer. But I'm only showing you the abstract because this is not, a week-long course and we can't get into it with a whole lot of depth. So I'm giving you sort of the Cliff's Notes of this just to show you what they did here in simple terms. What a major caveat of this is that they are saying that there are a lot of limitations in the research that's been done on this topic. And so, okay, so it says, uh, maybe it doesn't even say it in the abstract, which it should. There's a lot of variability in the quality of this evidence. That being said, there do appear to be some improvements based on what they were able to look at, including coping, somatic symptoms, so that's symptoms in the body, emotional symptoms, stress response, and attention, specifically the attention component of cognition. And that kind of makes sense. I often say that when we're looking at the health effects of meditation, they're pretty logical. What you would think improves tends to improve. For example, if you engage in loving kindness meditation regularly, it tends to increase your capacity for compassion because you are literally practicing compassion with a loving kindness meditation. So mindfulness is asking you to pay attention to everything that's going on right now, right? So what do I notice? What are the sounds around me? What's the feeling of the temperature of the air on my skin? What do I notice in my body, right? All of that is attention. So it makes sense that if an aspect of cognition was going to improve with mindfulness, it would be attention, which definitely is something that tends to be challenged for people who have had concussion. It's also worth noting that the symptoms of a concussion are affected by the specific concussion itself. So there are lots of different types of concussion, and the way that the concussion happens, you can injure different parts of your brain. So depending on how your brain gets injured, that's going to affect some of the challenges that you have. So that's important to note, that while we could say this form of meditation tends to be good for people with concussion, well, it depends on what are the challenges for that particular person with concussion. So we so far said maybe a guided meditation is a good idea, maybe a mindfulness meditation is a good idea. And I will say, as somebody who has had this lived experience, that mindfulness was probably, if I were going to meditate, which I didn't do for a while, mindfulness was probably one of the more accessible, because to be able to actually focus on one thing, like a concentrative form of meditation might be, right, like a vipassana or like a mantra, that would have been really hard for my brain to hold. Speaking from my own personal experience, that may not be true for others with concussion. And there is one more. Oh no, that's yoga. There was one more systematic review, I think. Yes. Okay. So this one is looking at meditation and yoga and mindfulness-based activities. It's a systematic review and meta-analysis. Maybe this is the one that says, yes, the need for rigorous trials. So study concerns, right? Not randomizing people, so you don't know if the groups are similar to each other. Not blinding, so people didn't know. I mean, the people who got meditation knew they were getting meditation, right? That's always going to be the case. But could, um, we could blind them to the research question, right? So we could teach them how to meditate and not explain to them, here's what we're trying to compare this type of meditation to that type of meditation to see what the effects are on these domains. And recording of adverse events. So, for example, there were some things I did in trying to feel better that actually made some of my symptoms worse, specifically my headache. I would notice that if I did too much of anything, the first thing I'd notice was my headache starting to get worse. And if they didn't report adverse events in the paper, then it's hard to know, okay, well, maybe some things are getting better, but maybe other things are getting worse. So it's saying here that fatigue and depression maybe tended to get better. But if your fatigue is getting better, but your headache is getting worse, that's kind of a trade-off, right? Um, and and again, this is looking at meditation, yoga, and mindfulness-based interventions really broadly. So we'd have to actually go into the paper and break it up and look at, well, what about meditation specifically, and which types of meditation? So I would say that this one, you can't really say anything conclusive about which type of meditation tends to be beneficial. Okay, so I'm actually going to stop there. And what I will say is, we don't know yet. There is definitely more evidence than there was. So if you looked at the dates of what I showed you, all of them have been published since my concussion when none of this was available, right? I know that we filtered from 2016 on, but if you would go back to the next few pages, you're going to see that those papers are less and less relevant to the question we were actually trying to ask. So from what we see there, we might say, okay, if we're going to try a meditation strategy, we might think about making sure that the person has some guidance so that they're not left to their own devices to try to control their own brain, which is frustrating, especially with not only the cognitive symptoms, but also the emotional symptoms. I will say also from a yogic philosophy perspective, and you will read this in my book if you haven't already, to confront your own sudden limitations. And those of you living with arthritis, especially an inflammatory arthritis that shows up overnight out of the clear blue sky, to all of the sudden not be able to do things that not only are you used to being able to do, but that you identify with strongly, right? This is the klesha of ego, the klesha of attachment. To try to meditate and realize that your brain doesn't work in a very simple way, that your brain is unable to do things that seem very rudimentary, can be an emotional experience. And a yoga professional, especially a yoga therapist, is well positioned to be able to help bring some philosophical perspective to that challenge, to what we call cognitively reframe. How can I think about this differently? And also, I would say short spurts of practice with anything. And it goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. Talk to your medical doctor, especially in the time immediately post concussion. There are recommendations that are important to follow. And so ask if you should be doing things differently in terms of your daily activities. I was actually finishing my first book when I had the concussion. And so I only used high levels of cognitive function in very short spurts. And especially I stopped when I got frustrated, and I stopped when I noticed any symptoms. And for me, that was my headache is getting worse. And so I'm going to put this aside and I'm going to go do a relaxation practice or a breathing practice or take an Epsom salt bath or whatever it might be. So get medical input, take it slowly, work through the ego identification, any psychological challenges that are coming up, recognize that emotional symptoms are part of the concussion. And so if you feel overly emotional, if you feel like, why am I getting so frustrated over a mindfulness practice, that's likely the concussion, as well as all of the stress of living with a concussion. But the mindfulness might actually help with that stress as well. And it's not a one size fits all. So every brain injury is different, and therefore every treatment strategy is going to have to be not only informed by the evidence, but also informed by the individual. A reminder that evidence-based practice uses the best available evidence, but also the experience and expertise of the provider, and especially the needs, priorities, preferences, concerns of the client, patient, student that you're working with. So hopefully that answers your question, Diane.
Thank you.
Okay, excellent. And actually, I think the announcements that I wanted to make, I have already made, which is that the audiobook is recorded and it will be coming out soon. And yeah, oh, yay, excellent. And I hope everybody has a wonderful month of July, and I hope to see you in the next Q&A. Feel free to reach out to me if you have follow-up questions about this. All right, take care. Om Shanti.